Good morning, folks, and welcome to Cloud Compromise, Lessons Learned from Mandiant Investigations. I'm Omar Lahdan.
My name is Will Silverstone.
And we're both from Mandiant Security Transformation Services team.
I'll go through the agenda here. We're going to break the session down into three kind of areas of focus that we see attackers taking advantage of when compromising cloud environments. That being living off the land, specifically within the cloud attack surface, and then third-party threats. For each of those, we'll go through some incident response case studies that our team has responded to, and then we'll talk through some general takeaways and recommendations that can help to secure your cloud environment. Now, if you watched our session last year, we used the same stat here to set the stage that when we talk about protecting against cloud compromise, we don't want to just think about cloud in isolation, in that 99% of organizations are running some sort of hybrid infrastructure, being both cloud and on-premise. Now, the other side of that story is that attacker tactics and motivations are constantly shifting. A few years ago, this was heavily focused on ransomware and encryption as kind of the most common attacker method and tactic and what they're going after. And what we've seen is a shift from encryption ransomware to now this multifaceted extortion, where attackers are exfiltrating data from organizations and using that to pressure them to pay. And bringing that data theft aspect into the fold is really where our focus on cloud comes in, where that's increasingly where the most critical data for organizations is being stored. So that's where we want to focus the session today, in that when we think about protecting against cloud compromise, our security approach should take into account the fact that lines between on-premise and cloud environments are blurred and overlapping, that we have an extended attack surface that includes cloud, includes on-premise, and is heavily focused on identity. And then to add to that, even if we're fully protecting our own environment, we have the risk of third-party access and vendors and software. And then lastly, that attacks are multidimensional, not just targeted to a specific cloud platform, but really take advantage of every piece of an organization's infrastructure.
Throughout the session, the three major themes that we'll cover: one, living off the land, how attackers leverage legitimate software, tools, and native cloud services to carry out cyber attacks. Two, cloud attack surface, an expanded attack surface with a hybrid and a cloud-only infrastructure setup. And three, third-party relationships, how a compromise at a service provider or within the supply chain process oftentimes lead to significant cloud incidents. For each of these themes, we'll dive into case studies as well as takeaways. Takeaways are mapped to four major pillars: identity, resources, network, and endpoints. Before we dive in, let's quickly give a quick overview of how Mandiant categorizes threat actors. Mandiant classifies threat actors in one of three buckets. One, APT, Advanced Persistent Threat Actors. Those are nation-state-sponsored threat actors. Two, FIN, or Financially Motivated Threat Actors. And third, UNC, or Uncategorized. Initially, every threat actor we track falls under that UNC category. From there, they may be reclassified into either a FIN or an APT. It's a long, complex process developed by the Mandiant intelligence team. And lastly, as we'll be going over some case studies, we've modified some of the facts to protect the identity of our clients as well as individuals associated with our clients.
So for the first kind of main area of focus around living off the land, specifically in the cloud, first we'll cover kind of what do we mean by living off the land in general. Next slide, we'll go through how that's reflected specifically within cloud environments. And so the general definition from CISA, involves abusing native tools and processes to blend in with normal activity and then being less likely to get caught because those tools are already trusted within the environment. Now, what does that look like specifically within cloud environments? We'll break that down into four kind of main areas. The first one around abusing trusted service infrastructure. By that we mean the platforms and tooling that is used to support and administer the overall environment. So that could be things like domain controllers for one, but also things like mobile device management platforms, EDR tooling, remote access support tools. And because these platforms have wide-ranging permissions across the environment, and we have to trust them in order to perform administration, they become perfect targets for attackers to go after. Second one around abusing native cloud service provider tools. So this one's similar but focused on those kind of trusted tools that are provided by cloud service providers. In the same way that the Windows version of living off the land could involve using built-in tools like PowerShell, this can be something like using the AWS CLI or G Cloud for reconnaissance, but also things like using a cloud admin portal to access a virtual machine, and then kind of moving laterally from there. Blending into legitimate traffic, so once I as an attacker have a foothold within a cloud environment, what can I do to maintain that access? Could be something as simple as creating a new admin account, or we'll talk about in an incident response case study, creating new virtual machines or new infrastructure, and then using that to stage attacks from. And lastly, around abusing trusted locations to bypass MFA, where many organizations are excluding trusted locations, so things like on-premise networks, VPN ranges, from MFA enforcement. And so if an attacker can get a foothold within a cloud environment, by deploying a new virtual machine, for example, they can use that to then gain single-factor access to additional resources within the environment. We'll go to our first incident response case study here, and to set the stage, this was an organization that was processing cryptocurrency transactions on a platform hosted in AWS, and specifically they had the private keys, username, passwords for their production crypto wallets hosted in the native secrets management platform on that cloud platform. And they were doing a lot of things right in terms of protecting access to that cloud environment, and especially to those production credentials. But what we're talking about in this case is how an attacker can use those trusted service infrastructure, those kind of management tools and platforms, to get around those controls and access the cloud platform. Now, what happened first here was the attacker was able to compromise low privileged developer credentials and then use that to access documentation, code repositories, architecture diagrams, kind of from that reconnaissance perspective to gain a deep understanding of what the environment looked like, who the administrators were, how they accessed the environment, all to be able to eventually blend into normal activity once they're ready to execute. Second piece is within a SharePoint site, they were able to identify clear text credentials to various other platforms, including the organization's mobile device management platform. And all this activity was over the course of a few months, and then once they were ready to execute their attack, the next couple of steps came over the course of a few hours, where they were able to push a malicious script from that mobile device management platform to targeted users' endpoints and exfiltrate AWS session keys off an administrator's device. And because these session keys were already authenticated with MFA, the attacker was then able to essentially replay these keys to access the AWS console and then achieve their goal of transferring cryptocurrency to that attacker-controlled wallet. And essentially, the attacker here was successful in this case because they were able to abuse that trusted service infrastructure, those management tools, in this case, the mobile device management platform, to gain access to AWS. So on the next slide here, we'll go through kind of some hardening takeaways for that trusted service infrastructure. At the identity level, obviously making sure MFA is enforced, but also using strong and phishing-resistant MFA methods, and we'll talk a lot about that throughout this presentation. For the credentials that are used to access that platform, making sure that we're monitoring for any leakage of those credentials, and also scanning for credentials in insecure locations, things like collaboration platforms and code repositories, things like that. At the network level, restricting access to the management console of that trusted service infrastructure to trusted networks only, so that they can't be accessed from anywhere on the internet. And then lastly, for logging and monitoring, we often see this as a gap that organizations aren't necessarily centralizing the logs from these management consoles of that key infrastructure, and that really limits the ability to, one, identify what's the baseline of normal activity, and then to develop any detections on any anomalous activity outside of that. We'll go into one additional incident response case study where the attacker was able to essentially blend into cloud infrastructure, that living off the land within the cloud, and in this case, exfiltrate data from this organization. Here, they were able to abuse weak authentication methods within the self-service password reset portal, things like SMS and security questions, to reset an administrator's credentials. Using that, they could then access the cloud administrative portal, where they then created a new virtual machine as a means to blend into normal traffic. Because now they were coming from a trusted location on the network, they had admin credentials, They then had the ability to access the organization's Credential Vault platform, which was hosted on a virtual machine in that same cloud infrastructure. Next, using their own attacker-controlled AWS account, they were able to exfiltrate the secrets, their credentials, the passwords from that vault to their own attacker-controlled S3 bucket. And then the last piece to kind of complete their goal was, one, they modified firewall rules on a SQL database, and then next, we're able to exfiltrate PII data to that same attacker-controlled S3 bucket. So now, like we talked about at the beginning, without deploying any encryption, they were able to extort this organization, threaten them to publish the data that they had stolen, and get them to pay a ransom, essentially. On top of that payment, even larger impact to the organization, they had to shut down access to their production applications in order to properly eradicate this attacker from their cloud infrastructure. A couple of takeaways from this one around the same 4 kind of pillars here. First one for identity. We'll talk through kind of hardening self-service password reset methods. So first, making sure we have an inventory of all the ways that both normal and privileged users can reset their passwords and modify MFA methods. And then ideally, any identities that are assigned privileged roles would be excluded from leveraging that self-service method and then forced to go through some defined approval process. The second one there, where we see an attacker able to get access into a cloud environment and use that to then pivot to additional access that doesn't require MFA, making sure that we're enforcing MFA not just from untrusted locations, but from all locations. On the resources side, one of the common living off the land tactics we talked about was deploying infrastructure to blend into normal traffic. So making sure that there's a baseline and inventory of how cloud resources are deployed, whether that's an infrastructure as code template or infrastructure code pipeline, an approval process, and then essentially creating targeted detections on any deployment outside of that process. On the network side, kind of considering how we can prevent that data exfiltration aspect. If this is from cloud virtual machines, making sure that we're blocking egress from servers, unless explicitly required. And then getting more granular to blocking uploads to unapproved cloud storage, either at a perimeter firewall level or using some sort of DLP tooling. Lastly, we want to be able to trust the devices that are being used to administer our cloud environment. So enforcing controls at minimum to make sure that those devices are managed and compliant, and then moving towards that privileged access, secure access workstation model for devices.
Our second theme focuses on attack surface, and as mentioned, with a cloud and hybrid infrastructure setup, organizations have an overall and expanded attack surface that needs to be accounted for as part of their overall security program. When you look at an on-prem only environment, your network, your egress firewall is your borderline, your first line of defense. But once you move to a hybrid or a cloud infrastructure, that shifts from network to identity. Even when we look at statistics, throughout 2023, more than 50% of cloud incidents originated from some sort of an identity compromise, whether that's password spraying, brute forcing, or even just leaked credentials. Let's dive into some common challenges in the identity realm that we oftentimes see organizations struggle with. These challenges frequently surface as root causes that either allowed an attacker to compromise an organization or allowed them to achieve their objectives. Number 1, blended identity model. A prevalent issue we see is the blended identity model, where organizations treat their cloud identity store and their on-prem identity store as a single entity. Common examples of that is syncing every account from on-prem to the cloud, managing cloud environments using on-prem identities, such as using Active Directory credentials, or even cloud administrators using their everyday accounts that they also use to access email and productivity tools to administer cloud environments. 2, ease of use over security. And I feel like this is a broader challenge that resonates with many security practitioners. Oftentimes, organizations, IT teams, and application teams prioritize ease and speed, even at the expense of security. And examples of that include allowing access to data or cloud administration portals from personal and managed devices, not restricting how and from where end users can register or modify their MFA settings, or even worse, a password reset portal that's exposed to the internet and only requires single factor to authenticate. And at the cloud lens, looking at keys and secrets, a significant challenge, especially in cloud environments, is the uncontrolled use of secrets and keys. This not only includes the widespread use of keys and secrets across your cloud provider, such as using service accounts in GCP or access keys in AWS. The use of these keys alone is risky, but it's even worse when they're assigned default highly privileged roles, like assigning a basic role to a service account within GCP. Without proper governance and detection capabilities, the management of these keys and secrets oftentimes spiral out of control. And inevitably, these keys and secrets end up in public code repositories. Our next case study is going to walk through a threat actor group that is prominent in circumventing identity controls, UNC3944, also known as Scattered Spider. This threat actor is financially motivated. It's been active since at least May of 2022, and they're notoriously known for two primary tactics. One, credential theft. They excel in obtaining credentials through various means, including phishing, end-user intimidation, or even calling the help desk directly and impersonating legitimate users. And two, living off the land. They use trusted tools and software already present in the environment or legitimate third-party software to maintain persistence within a compromised network. Historically, UNC3944's primary goal was extortion and data theft, steal data, intimidate organizations to pay money. However, over the last year and a half, their tactics have evolved to multifaceted extortion, where they not only steal data, but also now mass deploy ransomware at scale. Let's talk through our next case study. In our next case study, we see UNC3944 registering two domains that closely resemble the victim organization's domain. They use the organization name, -helpdesk, and -sso.com. Once these are registered, they launched an SMS campaign, also known as a smishing campaign, sending end users multiple and 100 text messages claiming to be from the help desk and urging them to use a link provided by the attacker to reset their password immediately. Eventually, a non-privileged user clicks on the link and unknowingly provided their credentials to the threat actor. UNC3944 then used the compromised creds to log into Entra ID. There's a default setting within Entra ID that allows non-privileged users from viewing the admin console. And in this case, the victim organization hadn't disabled that setting, which allowed the attacker to directly access the admin console. Once they were able to get on the admin console, they were able to view configs within the console, but more importantly, they were able to see who the privileged accounts are, along with their username, their personal name, and their corresponding email address. We then see UNC3944 compile and download a list of username and emails they want to target. They want to get creds for these accounts. And they launch a password spraying campaign against these accounts. After multiple attempts, they were successful in compromising two accounts. One was the Break Glass Global Admin account that was excluded from all multi-factor authentication enforcement, and another account that was the Password Vault on-prem admin account that hadn't yet registered in multi-factor authentication. Now, with the compromised creds, we see UNC3944 use the compromised global admin account to directly log into the console, where they access Microsoft Defender to whitelist malware. Then they access Intune and mass deploy that malware across every Intune managed endpoint. Essentially, what that malware did is once it's executed, it automatically drops remote access tools. And then additionally, we see them register a VM, a virtual machine, in Entra ID, and with their virtual machine now trusted, they log into the VPN, move laterally across the network to access the password vault. Using the second compromised account, they were able to directly access the password vault, retrieve additional credentials. One was for a domain admin account, an additional account which was the VMware root account. From there, we see them access Active Directory, take a copy of the Active Directory database, and then lastly move to the VMware infrastructure where they mass deploy ransomware at scale. So looking at this case, what really went wrong? When we look at the identity level, the organization allowed single-factor authentication. One of the compromised accounts didn't have MFA. But even in their MFA enforcement, there was gaps, inconsistent implementation, even across their privileged accounts. We also saw an on-prem Vault admin account on-prem that was synced up to the cloud. And this practice extended the attack surface of on-prem to the cloud. At the resource level, we saw default configurations that provided the attacker with reconnaissance abilities. And at the logging and monitoring, we saw domain registrations that were not detected. Malicious domain registration is a widespread attacker technique that's often used, and it's usually an indication that an attack or a phishing campaign is about to kick off. Now let's shift gears and take a look at a different case study within a cloud-only environment that also resulted in a ransomware attack. And in this case, we have an AWS administrator that's working remotely from home. They're testing a new service. And as part of the testing they're doing, they created an access key. When you create an access key in AWS, there's two ways you can view its credentials. Either you view it in the console or you download it as a CSV. And in this case, the administrator downloads it in a CSV. It gets stored locally on their laptop in the downloads folder. But they also assign that access key the native default administrator role in AWS. Few months go by, the administrator is applying to different jobs. They end up receiving a job offer through their personal email. And once they open up that job offer, it executes embedded malware that steals certain files, specific naming convention, cookies on the endpoint, ships all that data to the attacker. As part of the data stolen was the access key created 4 months ago by that administrator. We then see the attacker log in programmatically using the compromised access key and starts executing reconnaissance commands to understand the lay of the land, understand where the victim organization is storing data. And then the next step was to execute approximately 2,000 API commands to one, download all the data stored in S3 bucket, and then two, delete all that data, and then lastly, upload a ransomware note. This case highlights how weak identity controls, unmanaged credentials, and inadequate monitoring led to a severe breach. We'll go over some tactical takeaways to understand how we can better protect against these types of incidents. At the identity level, identifying where long-lived credentials are used and restricting their access. The bare minimum is not assigning them default roles in the cloud. At the resource level, establishing a baseline of operations to understand how many expected API calls and commands are expected in the environment and setting up detections to alert on any deviation from these standards. And then lastly, at the endpoint level, the bare minimum is restricting administrative access to managed, controlled, and monitored endpoints.
So we've talked so far about kind of the risks and challenges of protecting your own cloud environment. And so if that wasn't enough, well, the last section here will go through kind of the risk of how trusted third-party services can really expand that cloud attack surface even further. So in general, third-party landscape as it relates to cloud environments over the past few years has looked a little bit like this, where we have companies A, B, and C here that have implemented all the security recommendations we've talked about so far, and they've blocked and detected any attacker that's targeted them. So where we've seen attackers turn, especially as it relates to cloud environments, is to target those third-party services and integrations, and we'll break that down into three kind of areas here. The first one around professional and technology service providers. So think like managed security providers or third-party SOCs that have access across a large number of cloud environments. And so if that third party is compromised, an attacker's ability to pivot from one organization to the next is fairly straightforward. Supply chain compromise, so where attackers can implant malicious code into legitimate tools. Very often we see this as an issue specifically in the cloud within the open source software perspective, especially a lot of container environments that rely on these. And then lastly, mergers and acquisitions. So even if you've locked down and secured your own cloud environment, we often see organizations struggle to integrate those acquired environments into those security standards. Now, to tie all that together, we'll cover our last IR case study where a third-party compromise led to ransomware within a victim's cloud environment. So here we had an organization that was leveraging a third-party service provider that accessed their network via hosted virtual desktops. And so a user from that organization, from that vendor, was looking to download a copy of Citrix Workspace in this case. They found they were unsuccessful, they were blocked, they went searching on Google for an alternative way to download it, essentially. And so they went out and downloaded what turned out to be a malicious copy that essentially downloaded InfoStealer malware on their endpoint, and credentials for that vendor would then appear on a dark web forum. A second group was able to identify within that data set that there was credentials for the victim organization that they were targeting, and using those credentials, they could then log into the single-factor VDI environment. And then in this case, they were able to break out to the virtual host that was underlying it. From there, they could move laterally to a domain controller, and their goal here was deploying ransomware, so they were able to create a GPO that deployed ransomware across the domain. And in this case, because the organization had a cloud environment with domain-joined virtual machines, there was nothing stopping the ransomware from propagating from that on-premise environment to the cloud virtual machines. And when we think about encryption-based ransomware in the cloud, this is very often the scenario we see, where the compromise doesn't always begin, or it doesn't often begin, with the cloud environment, and there's very often some on-premise component to it. A couple of takeaways before moving to the wrap-up section. From the identity side, overall goal being to trust the identities that are administering our environment. So if those identities are third parties that aren't part of our organization, putting in those controls to be able to enforce that trust as much as possible. So things like segmenting those users into separate groups or separate identity stores to be able to enforce more granular controls on them. And then putting in kind of a tiered network architecture to limit the resources that they can access. Second bullet there around just-in-time access. So if a third party needs to administer some part of your cloud environment, that they're at minimum enforced for MFA, but ideally have to go through some approval process to then elevate to that privileged access. On the resources side, one, making sure that there's an inventory of third-party access and software within the organization, and then monitoring that external attack surface, in this case, focused on monitoring for leaked credentials that can be used to access your organization's resources. Like we saw in this case, even the organization itself wasn't compromised, their associated credentials ended up being leaked on that dark web forum. On the network side, this one comes up as a common challenge for organizations that want to limit access to trusted locations only, but still have third parties that need to access their network. And so enforcing that maybe third-party access comes from specific networks only, and then putting that monitoring in place to identify any risky users, risky sign-ons, things like that. And then lastly, for endpoints, if you're allowing access from third parties, making sure you're enforcing that same level of security controls to their endpoints and to their virtual desktops as well. So things like making sure EDR is installed, restricting the use of personal devices, and then monitoring for any abuse of the virtual desktop environments.
So over the last 25-30 minutes, we've presented some alarming scenarios, and you might even be asking yourself, why did we come to this session? The good news is it's not all doom and gloom. In the majority of the cases we discussed, there was fundamental gaps in the victim organization's security controls. And really, without addressing these gaps, there was no way to detect, alert, or even prevent these attacks in the first place. Over the next set of slides, we'll talk through some foundational controls, many of which that we've touched on already, that you can start implementing today. We'll present these controls in a phased approach to make them easier to implement as well as to manage. Starting off with phase one, targeted attack surface reduction. And the goal of this phase is to protect most sensitive components of an infrastructure. At the identity level, enforcing multi-factor authentication across all users, all applications, and throughout all networks. And if we have accounts that we cannot enforce multi-factor authentication on, that's fine as long as we restrict their login to your internal network only. At the resources and network level, reviewing and restricting publicly exposed resources, virtual machines, storage buckets, databases, and many other cloud resources. The goal is to minimize the entry points in as much as possible. At the device level, restricting device enrollment methods so that we can control and govern devices that are authenticating to our applications, as well as connecting into our network. But then also disabling legacy configurations that are commonly abused by attackers, like configurations that allow credentials to be in plain text on memory, or configurations that allow weak Kerberos authentication types, such as RC4. We can easily knock these off, but if we stick to an industry benchmarks such as CIS. The end goal of phase 1 is to minimize the entry points that can be exploited by an attacker to gain, maintain, or escalate their access. Then we move to phase 2, where we focus on segmenting the core infrastructure. At the identity level, segmenting privileged accounts. If you're privileged in cloud, we want to use cloud-based identities that stay in the cloud and do not sync them back to on-prem. And if you're an on-prem privileged identity, then you remain on-prem. We want to minimize the exposure of our privileged accounts as much as possible. At the resources and network level, restricting network access to cloud services. We want to restrict access to cloud administration portals, password reset portals, as well as trusted service infrastructure administration consoles. A console to your EDR or to your privileged access management solution should not be accessible from any network. And at the endpoint level, start to build and use privileged access workstations, at least for all administrative functions across your tier 0 assets. The main goal of phase 2 is to minimize the exposure of our critical and most sensitive components of our infrastructure. And then we move to phase 3, where we want to make sure that we have the right detections in place in case controls in phase 1 and phase 2 fail us. Across the identity, we want to build targeted password reset, MFA registration modification detections, looking at all modifications across our privileged identities, but also building detections to account for any abnormal changes across our end users. And if you want to take this up a notch, then monitor for leaked or compromised credentials. Across your resources and network, monitoring the trusted service infrastructure tool. The goal is to break the inherent trust that we have in our security tools and account for them as part of our log ingestion and detection capabilities. And across our endpoints, building detections across systems that we care about the most. If we're building POS in phase 2, then we better know and have visibility into each action performed on these systems. But also, if we have file shares on-prem with sensitive data, or even in the cloud, having the right detections over downloads so that we're able to detect any exfil opportunities, for example. The end goal of phase 3 is to detect any destructive and noisy attacks as early as possible. Then we move to our final phase, phase 4, where we focus on defending against modern attack techniques. However, implementing these controls usually will require additional capital, resources, and testing, but they're essential to stay ahead of the curve. At the identity level, enforcing phishing-resistant multi-factor authentication. At the resource and network level, implementing targeted preventative controls that directly address the human error we see in the cloud, such as mistakenly exposing a virtual machine or a storage bucket in the cloud. And at the endpoint level, integrating device checks with authentication so that we can restrict and control devices that are authenticating to our applications, accessing our data, and administering our cloud environments. At the end of the day, reducing your attack surface will not happen through the implementation of a single tool, a single configuration, or control. It's a multi-layered approach through the implementation of targeted restrictions, hardening measures, response actions, and detections across the different layers of your managed identity, resources, network, and endpoints. And with that, thank you all for your time today. Hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.